Hello, everyone, and welcome to this next session of AAC in the Cloud. We're excited to have you join us for this final session of the day. This session will be presented by Kathy Howery, and the session title is The Meaning of Voice, the Lived Experience of Speech-Generating Device Users. We're excited to hear from Kathy's experience. She has a lot to share, and we will turn things over to her. Kathy.
Great. Most of us take the ability to speak utterly for granted. To speak is to have a voice, to be understood by others through the use of our voice. From the time we are very young children, our primary means of communication is through speech. We talk with our friends. We whisper secrets. We shout and cheer at the top of our lungs and make our voices heard. We share our stories across space and tell our stories across generations. But what if you couldn't speak or use your hands? How would you communicate? How could you prove that you could learn, that you have an opinion, that you matter? As educators, we may assume our students' ability to talk, to express themselves through audible speech. When children come into our classrooms, we focus on literacy and numeracy. We help them explore and inquire into the world of science and history. We assume we are drawing upon a foundation of speech. We may take a child's ability to speak utterly for granted. But consider the non-speaking child, a child who can hear the words being spoken around them, but who, due to an unruly body, cannot coordinate the breath, sound, and movement necessary to produce intelligible speech of their own accord. A child who, to give independent voice to their thoughts, must do so through a speech-generating device.
First I think what to say, then I input the words into my device. Once I have constructed my message, I push speak so that I can speak those words out loud.
Merleau-Ponty, the famous French philosopher, tells us when we speak, we do not think of speaking. Rather, if we think at all, we think of what we are saying. We must, in fact, stop picturing the code or even the message to ourselves and make ourselves sheer operators of the spoken word. While this rings true for those of us who speak with our natural voices, it hardly seems the case for those who speak with machine. Welcome. My name is Kathy Howery. What I'm going to share with you this afternoon, is part of a broader phenomenological study into what it's like to speak with a speech-generating device. During my doctoral program, some few years ago now, I spent 5 years plus reading accounts of speech-generating device users, interviewing young people with physical disabilities who use or who have used speech-generating devices in the context of classrooms and social activities, and being with these same young people on a day-to-day basis. This being with is referred to in phenomenology as close observation. Well, prior to engaging this research, I had been with young people who used AAC countless times at various points in my career, but it was always for a different purpose. I had never been with them to just watch, to learn, to understand. In the past, I was always there to help, to intervene, to implement. During this study, I merely watched and listened and watched. I will always remember the frown of disapproval on the speech therapist's face as I failed one speech assessment after another. The therapist seemed particularly officious, and she told Davina and me that the lip reading and sign reading system that we had fashioned on our own was insufficient. She assumed no one could learn it, and I would be restricted in communication if I did not acquire an artificial voice. You know, no one will understand you. You will be dependent on your wife and mother-in-law. Don't you want to be independent? Don't you want to be independent? These are the words of Albert Robillard, a professor of sociology who acquired a motor neuron disease and, like many people with this condition, lost the ability to speak intelligible, audible words. In his book, Meaning of Disability, The Lived Experience of Paralysis, Dr. Robillard recounts his journey through his disease as perhaps only a trained ethnographer might, using the insights that can only come with the experience as lived through. Don't you want to be independent? Dr. Robillard lived in a time when speech generating devices were just emerging as viable alternatives for people with complex communication needs. His book, published in 1999, in his book, published in 1999, he speaks of trialing macaws and other simple speech generating devices of the day. What he mostly speaks of is the institutions of individualism, the value that Western society places on independent individuals, and the belief that independence is good and dependence is somehow bad, and the widespread belief that every problem has a technological fix. As he said, he was told he would be made into a bionic man. Yet throughout the book, what he holds on to is being a man, and what he persistently rails against are the demands of the device. In the years before speech generating devices were created, the communication system that Dr. Robillard and his wife fashioned would have seemed wonderful and inventive. The fact that he was also able to have his doctoral students learn his speech system was more marvelous, as it allowed him to go on with his work, not independently, mind you, but in a timely and, we shall say, collegial manner. But Dr. Robillard's experience of disability happened at a time where the bright new shiny hope of AAC devices, indeed the very field of AAC itself, was emerging. And because these devices were available in the world, because they existed, there was already for Dr. Robillard a demand that they be used. I, like many of you who are with me in the cloud today, have worked in the field of assistive technology and augmentative and alternative communication for decades. My belief of my time of the belief in the power of technology to provide independence and voice to children with complex communication needs began long before 1999. My journey began in the world. My journey into this world began in 1982 with Apple IIe computers, unicorn keyboards, Echo speech synthesizers, and the amazing Zygo 100. I was working in a private school for children with significant and multiple disabilities, and through the power of this emerging technology, I was able to support them to do things not imaginable without computers and devices. They could play games independently, they could talk, albeit in one or two word phrases, and they could write. It was a heady time, and I was hooked on AT and AAC. In the 1980s, if anyone would have shown me an Accent or a T10 or an iPad with Prologo or Lamp or Cough Drop or any of the myriad of apps currently available, I would have believed all my dreams for these children would have been fulfilled. Then, in a movie theater in San Francisco in 2006, my first inclination that maybe there was something more, something that I was yet to understand, began to form in my brain. I had read the book Diving Bell and Butterfly several years before, but I must say I did not enjoy it. I was working in this assistive device service, and I knew well the tools and gadgets that Bobby could have been provided with. Eye blink switches, environmental control systems, scanning on-screen keyboards, scanning voice output devices. This was, after all, around the same time as Robillard was writing his book. Where were the parade of devices for Bobby to try? Why was he relegated to be dependent, there's that word, on a partner to audibly go through the alphabet letter by letter, watching for his blink, then one by one writing those letters down? Why didn't someone get this man some technology? My annoyance at what I saw at the time as being a huge gap in his services actually got in my way of reading the book. I was so angry that for a time I put it down. As the story once again unfolded in front of me in the screen in the movie theater that day, I found myself beginning to think those same thoughts. Why don't they give him some technology? In one scene, he's left alone in the hospital bed with the TV. I can't recall if someone turned it on and left, or turned it off and left. But either way, I remember him being alone and without any means of controlling what he could or would watch. I was once again aghast. He could have at least had an environmental control unit. He could have had a switch. He could have at least turned the TV off and on instead of being so alone and helpless. As the story continued, he was introduced to the partner-assisted scanning system that he came to use to communicate and to write his book. Once again, I was frustrated by what I was seeing. Surely someone could do better than this painstakingly slow system. However, as I sat in the movie theater, something happened. As I sat watching him slowly, methodically, one letter by one letter, dictate to his attendant, I was taken aback by what I saw. Here was a man and a woman in a caring, interactive relationship, together working tirelessly and hourlessly crafting his text. She would patiently and methodically say the letters. He would patiently and methodically blink when she reached the one he wanted. The back and forth of their system was reliant upon both of them working together to co construct his text. What I was seeing before me wasn't the desperate need for technology, but the amazing power of two human beings connecting to bring forth one person's voice. As I watched, I considered what I might have provided for him if it had my way. It would have been a scanning system, all right, but one that was devoid of the human assistant. My way, he could have written it himself. He would have had no need for the human interface. He would have been independent. But at what cost? As I sat there in the theater that evening, a huge doubt crept into my world. What if I had indeed been his therapist? What if I had intervened? Rather than engaging for hours on end with a human being, would Bobby have been situated in front of a computer, blinking his book all right, but blinking it to a screen? So that brings me to my question of today, some 2 decades later, and to the topic of my research in this presentation. From the seeds of doubt and wonder that were sown for me in that movie theater, I have come to wonder deeply, not what I think it might be like to speak with a device, but what it is really like. And most particularly for me, what is like for a child in the classroom who speaks with, or is it through, a machine. My method is phenomenology. Phenomenology as a method investigates the lived experience of those who have experienced a phenomenon in a certain way. In the simplest terms, it may be described as the study of lived experience. Phenomenology is primarily a method of and for questioning, rather than a method for answering or discovering or drawing determinate conclusions. The hope is that in the questioning, there exists the possibility and potential for experiencing openings, understandings, and insights that may give us glances to the meaning of the phenomenon and the events around it in their singularity. Phenomenology is the study of the life world, the world as is immediately experienced. In order to accomplish this, one must seek concrete lived experiences, experiences as lived through. While this might seem a simple task, it is often not. In my study, for example, when I asked the young people to tell me about a time they spoke with a speech generating device, they would often say, "Oh, it was great. It helped me to speak to others. It helped me to communicate." While all these reflections on the experience are most likely true, they are reflections, not the actual experience itself. It is far easier to have someone recount what they think about something than to tell you about the concrete moment of experience. Phenomenology seeks to show what it is like, not to tell what it is about like, to understand what it might be like, not to explain why it might be so. As Sarah Blackstone points out, the most important voices are often the hardest to hear. I gathered lived experience description from numerous sources. I read everything I could find on by people who've written about the experience of speaking through a speech generating device. I also looked for and sometimes found concrete lived experience descriptions in AAC and AT literature. But primarily, my sources for these stories of lived experience were derived from speaking with participants in my study. The participants were all proficient users of so-called high-end speech generating devices and were currently or had fairly recently used these devices in K-12 settings. They were asked to share their experiences of using speech generating devices, particularly those which involved their memories of school. I gathered their stories through interview, both face to face, which often took many hours, and virtually, which often took many days. And through being with these young people in their daily lives and documenting moments of augmented communication. and through electronic means over a period of months, and in some cases, even years. What I would like to do now is provide a glimpse into one of the aspects of speaking through a device, what the meaning of voice is. What is it really like to speak with a speech generating device? It might be first voicing my being in the world. I recall the day that Josie came into the center for the first time. She was coming to see about getting a speech generating device. Here was a 7-year-old little girl whose eyes shone with expression, but who had no speech. As we sat around the table discussing Josie's need for a device, I grabbed one from the back room and started to program in a few phrases. Then I sat with Josie and showed her how the message could be spoken aloud by touching the buttons. Before long, it was obvious to me that Josie understood how the device worked, and she took over. Mom, look at me, Josie spoke aloud by pressing the buttons on the device and looked up at her mom to see if she was listening. No response. I whispered, try again, Josie, and turned up the volume. She did. Mom, look at me. This time her mom heard. She looked up, a little confused. On cue, Josie spoke again. Mom, look at me. And that's when the magic happened. Her mom looked, and Josie said, Mom, come here, with no prompting, and giggled loudly. Her mother, now practically at the point of tears, came over. Mom, look at me, said Josie. I am looking, Josie. This anecdote speaks to the powerful impact of a child acquiring a voice, her ability to voice her being in the world. Look at me, here I am. How strange, though, when one considered it is not really her voice at all. In fact, in this particular instance, the words were spoken by my voice as I had recorded the phrases into the buttons that Josie activated to speak. What is it then, speaking in one's own voice, and how very different is this experience for one who speaks with the machine?
The first day I met the principal, he acted like I didn't even have my talker. He just talked to my aide even though I was right there. This made me mad. I got my head in gear and told him, I can understand everything you say you know. After that we became friends. He never talked around me again.
When a child typically enters the principal's office on the first day of school, he is welcomed, addressed. He is spoken to and spoken with. John tells us a different story, a story of not being unheard, not only being unheard, but perhaps of being unseen. It is only through the audible assertion of himself, not only as present in the room, but as a person who will not be passed over in silence, does this principal readdress himself to John. How interesting that the audible voice has this power. Would it have been the same if John had gotten his assistant to say those words by pointing to letters on a board? How might he be perceived if he tried to indicate that he was annoyed through other nonverbal communication? Without his device, could John have articulated his capable presence through the conversation being carried out by the two adults about him? Or would he have been forced to sit in silence, unheard and unseen as a passive listener? Clearly, voice matters. Our voice is as unique as our fingerprint and is personal. For most of us, our voice is not ours to choose. It is just what we are given, our voice. That is, unless we must speak with the voice of the machine.
When I got my talker, the first thing I did was to listen to the voices. I saw the one named Jill. I like that name, but it was so old it's not my voice. It sounds like an old grandma. Okay, so I thought maybe I would try Samantha. She sounds like a baby. I am not a baby. Then I saw a voice that didn't have a name. It was called 13 Cool Girl. I'll listen to that voice. That was it. That's my voice. A cool kid voice, just like Mom always says I am one cool kid.
As the result of the amazing developments in speech synthesis technologies, today's voices sound wondrously human. Many even provide attention to the messages carried by the voice itself. Our voices say so much about us. They tell of our sex, our age, even our history. How interesting then is Gabby's task to search through the voices available to her on her new device until she found her voice. A girl's voice first. The voice must establish her as female, as certainly that would be important for an adolescent girl. And it must not sound too old or too young. Like Goldilocks in search of comfort in the home of the three bears, Gabby tries on the synthetic voices, not too old, not too young, just right. But one must wonder, how could it be just right? What is still missing about Gabby in this voice from the machine?
I was watching the YouTube video where Carly Fleischman was interviewing Channing Tatum. She uses the same voice as me. So when I closed my eyes, I could just imagine that it was me that was interviewing him. It was so cool.
Hearing your own voice coming from someone else's mouth. How strange that would be. Unless perhaps you are an actor doing voiceovers, but even then one might wonder if it would be at least a bit disquieting to hear your voice as the voice of another. Yet for Liz, this does not seem strange. In fact, it seems rather ordinary, and in this particular instance, rather fun. She can listen for herself, interviewing one of today's most recognizable, and she would probably say hot young actors. All she has to do is close her eyes and listen. While the voices offered up for use by Liz may be varied, they are also finite. It is not uncommon for two people like Liz and Carly, who use speech generating devices, to use the same voice. Indeed, many of the young speech generating devices users that I have encountered speak with the same voice, literally the same voice. They tell me it is because it is a voice that people can understand the best. The voice is one of high quality, yet it's also a voice with no particularly special features, no accent, no age specification, no particular personality. Perhaps one might think of this as a high quality, neutral voice. How ironic this may seem that despite all the choice of voice, the selection may not end up to being the voice that fits the user. Instead, the decision may be dictated by what the speech impaired person is seeking from the device in the first place, the desire to be understood. And to have a voice may seem to open an audible space that without a speech generating device may always be out of reach. Let us listen to Jessie as she reaches across the room with her voice.
I like to use my talker to bug kids in my class, especially kids like Mike. We were in science class together. He was sitting right in front of me. I was thinking boron the moron, so I typed it into my device boron. It was quiet in class, so all the kids heard, and everybody started laughing. I could tell by his face he knew I was talking to him. He got all mad and called me a nerd. I called him boron for the rest of the year.
Jessie's account is ordinary in so many ways. Who as the child has not called someone a name, especially someone who you want to get to pay attention to you? Jessie's no different. She has found a way to tease her friend Mike that is both clever. Boron is an element, you know, she told me with a grin when she recounted her story of bugging Mike in science class, and effective. She got a response from Mike, and she and everyone else knows it because Jessie got Mike to respond in kind. Nerd. Success. By reaching out across the audible space afforded Jessie with her speech generating device, she has joined into the foray. She can tease and be teased back. She has become perhaps one of the gang. With the power of her voice, Jessie has made an auditory bond with her classmates. Would this bond have been possible without the voice of the machine? And yet, for a child who uses a speech generating device, their voice, or for sure their words, may not be their own. Unlike a child who has learned to speak naturally and therefore, in the true sense, have their words, a child who uses a speech generating device is given theirs. Parents, therapists, or teachers put vocabulary, words, into the devices. When children are learning to use their speech generating devices, they must find the vocabulary that others have provided for them. Consider Jane's memories of her days at school.
Last year I got my first talking device, which is called the Couch Talker. My therapist Chris came to school to teach me MinSpeak. I feel Chris did a great job on teaching me where the icons were and what they meant. She did not teach me how to express myself with it. For example, one particular day I will send out of the classroom for drooling, but really I had just sneezed out some muffin. For the life of me I couldn't find the words to say that I had just sneezed.
Jane's recollection may be as much a story of abuse as a story of not being able to find the words to say on her device. And it may be important for us to consider both. The expressive language of children who use speech generating devices are often restricted by factors that are out of their control. What these children can express at any one time is largely dependent on the accessibility of their system and the specific vocabulary that is available to them. Despite her ability to physically push the buttons, the cognitive demands of recalling where the words were to say, "I just sneezed," remain beyond her reach. Not being able to find our words is something that we can all recognize. It's on the tip of our tongue, we might say, but seldom are we really silenced by our search. Instead, we find other words to express ourselves. Not so for Jane. She is left silently searching and vulnerable. Without words that one can express on one's own, can a child ever really be safe? Merleau-Ponty tells us that silence is a choice only given to those who can speak. Let us listen to what is revealed by Gabby as she is rendered silent not by choice, but because she's without her speech generating device.
One time I had to go to the hospital for tests and I didn't have my communication device. The nurse asked my mom, "Does she need a diaper?" I was so angry. I showed her my angry face. She asked my mom, "What is it?" And mom said she is mad because she has been trained since she was 2 and she understands everything that you say. She came over and talked to me very slowly and loudly, just like I couldn't hear. I think if I had my device, this would not have happened. People think when you can't talk, you are dumb.
The word dumb derives from the Nordic languages, where it had both the meaning to be silent, unable to speak, or defective in perception and wits. In today's usage, the second meaning of dumb, as related to intelligence, is unfortunately far more common. To be dumb is to be lacking in intelligent or good judgment, stupid, dull-witted. We may also speak of someone being deaf and dumb. People who are deaf often do not speak with their voice, their mouth voice. Hence, the phrase was coined. And throughout history, many of them were also incorrectly considered feeble-minded or lacking in intellect, reinforcing the double meaning of the word dumb. Being without her device, temporarily speechless, Gabby was understood as dumb, needing to be spoken to loudly, slowly, assuming that either she could not hear or at least she could not understand rapid speech. Those of us who play or have played bridge may recall that the silenced partner is called the dummy. The dummy is taken out of play, remaining silently passive as his partner directs the play in both of their hands. Gabby seems to be saying, "I am no dummy, but without my device, I am understood as such. I am removed from the interaction while all the play is directed to my partner, who is now expected to speak and interact for me." How frustrating this must be, to be treated as a child, to be spoken to in a manner that suggests you cannot possibly understand what is being said. This would be annoying for any one of us, but for a teenager who is at the stage of her life where she is trying to assert her autonomy and independence and herself in the world, being without her device, her voice may be especially detrimental.
One time I tried to use my device to call Handy Bus. I called them and somebody picked up the phone at Handy Bus. I said I want to be picked up this Friday at 1:30. My address is 3453 Apple Way. The Handy Bus person said, "What do you want?" I repeated my message. "I want to be picked up this Friday at 1:30. My address is 3453 Apple Way." The line went dead. Maybe they thought I was a crankpot. I don't know. Anyway, I thought, okay, next. I guess I wait till Mom comes home and she can call them. I think they will know she is a real person.
Tyler was attempting to do what we all may do on a regular basis, use the phone to request a service. We may be calling for a taxi or calling for a pizza. When we do, we pay attention to why we are calling, what the message is that we want to convey. Our voice announces us, but unless we have a malady, such as a cold or laryngitis, our voice is passed over unnoticed, except to bring ourselves into meaningful contact with the other human being on the line. This is not so for Tyler. For Tyler, the voice got in the way. Today, we may hear synthetic speech on the other line of the telephone so often that many of us may be tempted to do to Tyler exactly what was done by the handy bus operator: hang up. A computer generated voice may speak for itself, telling the person on the other end that there's really no one present on the call, but rather it's a robocall or a computer, and the message is not in real time from a person presently connected, but recorded so as to make a marketing or general information call. So we too may decide within seconds of hearing that voice that we are not interested in listening to it. We are not compelled to listen, as there's really no one there that we are in real contact with. So, what has happened for Tyler? It seems that with the voice of the machine, he is not heard. In attempting to speak for himself, one may say he has disappeared. His presence as a person is not heard, but is rather stifled by the voice of the machine. The very technology that allowed him to participate in the world of speaking beings has itself acted once again to relegate him to silence. He is, one might suggest, once again disabled in this new world of everyday use of computer generated speech. And yet, as difficult and arduous a task as speaking through a device may seem, the power of audible voice can still have a wonderful and positive impact on the life of a child who cannot speak. Gym class was the first time that I really understood having the power of voice. I remember my teachers had programmed things for me to say into some of my other devices before. Things like saying good morning, things like answers to a math question, things like a line in the page of a story. Somehow those things never really seemed to matter. But that day in gym class was different. That day, my teacher put 2 words in my talker. Only 2 words. Then she told the class that we were going to play a running game and that I was in charge. I was in charge? How would that work? And then she said, "Okay, Katie, tell us what to do." I remember being confused, but then just pushing one of the buttons. Go. And all the kids started to run. I kind of went into a spasm and hit the same button again. Go, I said, and they all went faster. Ha, okay, now I get it. I pushed the other button. Stop. It was really noisy with all the kids running, so they didn't hear me. I looked up at my teacher. She turned the volume all the way up on my talker. Stop. This time they heard me, and all the kids screeched to a halt, some of them even yelling, "Screech!" Then they all looked at me. I giggled. Go! This time Miss Jackson pushed my wheelchair so I could go too. Go, 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 I said, and we all ran faster. Stop! And we all stopped, bumping into each other and laughing as we did. Stop, stop, go. I kept yelling with my talker. I was laughing so hard, tears were streaming down my face. Finally, Miss Jackson said, "Katie, I'm pooped," and she blew the whistle. We all stopped for good. Jordan, who had never paid any attention to me before, ran up to us and said, "Katie, can you tell us what to do at gym all the time?" That was fun. Lingus reminds us of the extraordinary power of voice to put us in contact. This is surely true for Katie. With those 2 small words, she has made contact, created connections. She was heard and she was seen. Her teacher, by giving her 2 small words that mattered to her and to her classmates, may have forever changed the children's perception of Katie, and it seems her perception of herself. Sociolinguists remind us that small talk is never small. It is small talk that connects us together. It is small talk that builds relationship. Yet for children who must use speech generating devices, small talk is anything but small.
I hate it when people call my device my voice. If my device is not with me, I still want people to communicate with and value me.
So, what is this thing we call voice? And do we miss out on much of a person's voice when we only listen to the voice of the machine? Having a voice, as we've just heard, is really so much more than the audible voice that's provided by the speech generating devices. To have a voice also refers to having a choice, to having the right to expression, to be able to influence power. We refer to voice of people in the political context. We suggest that we need to make people's voices heard. An organization may be the voice of a group. These metaphorical meanings of voice must also be considered as we reflect on what voice means for those who use a speech generating device to project theirs out into the world. What may be lost when there is a screen between the speaker and the listener? What of gesture, facial expression, sadness, joy? One young man who uses both a speech generating device and his natural voice says, I use my vantage to give talks. I use my voice to just talk. In his book, Why We Don't Talk to Each Other Anymore, The Devoicing of Society, linguist John Locke suggests that speaking and talking are indeed two separate but related types of verbal behaviors. He says that people speak to convey factual information, that speaking is more formally structured than talking. We speak to exchange information. Talking, on the other hand, is a social business. We talk not so much to convey information, but in fact to create social closeness. Once again, I came to understand this not through a book, but by meeting Dylan. The first time I spoke with Dylan was via Skype. I was shocked to see that he was using a communication board and that he had an assistant speaking for him. I forgot even to ask him my usual questions about his experiences. Instead, I peppered him with, well, have you tried this? Have you seen that? He responded by sharing a story. I was presenting at a conference. I had received an award, so you could say that I was probably a bit more high profile than most participants. My brother was acted as my attendant. Many of the new people that I met at the conference were quick to give their opinion on other technologies and approaches that would work better for me. So many of these people never took the time to listen to my journey of the extensive things I have tried. In nearly all cases, their suggestion was something that I'd already explored. Also, it seemed that only high tech solutions were valued. Many of these people made me feel I was a failure because I was still using, quote, low tech, unquote, approach. There was more than one person who commented that they hoped that I would get independent and use computer technology to respond to their questions rather than my brother as my facilitator. What they didn't know, and what I admit I did not bother to tell them, was that I was deliberately using low tech facilitation so that I could quickly meet and respond to people's questions. My voice output was so slow, it would have taken me forever to respond. It was so frustrating. Meeting Dylan face to face was definitely a turning point for me. My expectations, perhaps more importantly, my long-held beliefs, were falling away. Despite his sharing his story with me, it was not until I met him that I realized it was not really that he couldn't use a device. He surely could. It was that the device would not meet his demands, the demands for truly engaging in communicative interaction. When I sat with Dylan that day, we had a wonderful conversation. He would point to the letters and words on his display, and I would co construct his message. Not unlike Bobe in the diving bell and the butterfly, Dylan would point and I would read, guess, fill in the words. If I guessed wrong, Dylan was quick to correct me. He was constantly demanding that my understanding be his words, that his voice be heard. Is this not truly what communication, conversation is? The co construction between two people engaged in meaning making together. My understanding of what was the best, of what was independence, changed that day in Dylan's kitchen. He was independent, truly independent in what he said. All I was doing was actively listening, perhaps in a manner that demanded more from me, but in a manner that let him share his voice in the way he wanted and the way that ensured he was being listened to and being heard. Is this not the essence of what having a voice really means? So, what can we learn from such a phenomenological study, and why is this type of knowledge important. I was asked this question the first time that I presented this kind of talk at Isaac in 2012. What I didn't say so well then, but I hope to say better today, that it's not really about creating theory and not really about explaining why. It's really about bringing us to question and to wonder, about deepening our understanding. I was asked, what can we do with this phenomenology that you just shared with us? And in my naivete that day, I said, well, it's not what phenomenology, or sorry, not what we do with phenomenology, it's what in the end phenomenology does with us. That day in 2012, I didn't really understand that. Today, some 7 years later, I definitely do. This opening to wonder, this opening to understanding has certainly changed my practice and questioned my assumptions about what it might be really like to be a speech generating device communicator and actually an AAC user in the broader sense. I have changed from what Van Manens calls the Gnostic or the cognitive way of knowing to the pathic and, shall I say, more feeling like understanding. From knowing to beginning to understand, I don't think I really understand yet what it may be really like to use a speech generating device to speak, and that there may be more to speech generating devices that allow persons with severe impairments to share their voice in the world. Sorry. We need to focus on this deeper understanding of how people with complex communication needs do and want to talk to us and with us. We need to listen deeply and tentatively so their authentic voices, whether computer generated or partner assisted or otherwise shared, may be actively and meaningfully listened to. So, my task of this inquiry continues as it ever began. I listening to the voices of people who use augmentative and alternative communication in whatever form to make their voices heard.
We have much to learn about assistive technology, about its power, about its potential, and, perhaps most of all, about its dreams deferred, about how much work you and I still have to do to close the gap between its promise and everyday reality.
As I listen, I hear that call, the call to make contact, to close that gap between the promise and the practice. I hear the call to help students and others with communication disabilities contact and reach their hopes and dreams for active, meaningful, and timely interactions in the classroom and ultimately to assert their voice in the world. I hear the call most of all to listen. And then, when all is said, but surely not done, is the message of people who speak with machines that the real transformational power of technology comes when the human beings and not the technology can be heard. I hope you may be called to listen too.
Fabulous. Oh, go ahead.
We're a little under time, but we have time for questions. As I said earlier, I cut and put and cut and put. Anyway, I would be delighted to hear people's questions or comments or thoughts.
Fabulous. If anybody has questions for Kathy, feel free to share them in the Slack chat and we will get those in with her. Obviously, you can see that she has a lot of experience and understanding, a lot of personal connections that have really helped to solidify her understanding of AAC and communication in general and how that can benefit and become a better benefit for the people that we're working to try to support and get to know and encourage. If anyone has any questions, feel free to post those in the Track One Slack chat and we'll get to those.
Or comments.
Or comments. That's a good point. Yes, exactly. In fact, there's one in here that I thought was fun. Marissa said that she loved the student who gave his graduation speech recently with a speech generating device. And that really was a powerful moment. That was a great thing to be able to see. Do you have thoughts on that, Kathy, that you'd like to share?
Yep. Absolutely. It was a very powerful moment, and uh, and I love those moments because it really does show that the power of AAC to allow people to meaningfully participate and to actively share their stories and their experience is real. The wonder that I have about those experiences are um, that, and I have another talk which I didn't. There's lots of different pieces, but when people and teachers and parents hear those recorded, so the young man who said, "I use my device to give talks. I use my voice to just talk." Sharing a pre-recorded talk is a brilliant and wonderful thing, but I worry that it gives false expectations that then with that same device, people can just converse and just talk with you. So while I celebrate that, I worry that it might set false expectations for parents and others who think therefore that kid can just converse with me, because maybe he can, but lots of times when students are sharing a pre-recorded speech, that's different than talking. So there's my
Your,
thoughts on
your
that.
tidbits on that. Actually, I think that's a really good point. We actually had a recorded a pre-conference session that was done by Christian Rosas here as part of AAC in the Cloud. And as we have people that fill out surveys, one of the survey comments that we got back, someone said, it's really too bad that we couldn't listen to Christian voice this himself instead of having someone else speak for him. And they didn't understand that Christian, this actually was his, it was his AAC device that was speaking, which I think is a different take on exactly what you said, that they didn't catch that this is his communication. This was his voice. He put this together because they were looking for and expecting something different. So yeah, I think you're right that it's really important that we kind of are aware and understand that things may not always work one way or the other. So thank you for sharing that, Kathy. Let's see, one question here. Marissa says, I loved that you included quotes from speech generating device users on your slides. Do you have thoughts on Stephen Hawking not using his device with a British accent? Oh, that's an interesting question.
Well, the only thoughts I have is that I understand that Stephen, I don't know why he chose that. And I think maybe to go to the point that I made is that often people choose a voice that can be understood. I also have heard this, don't know it for true, that Dr. Hawking decided that basically the very old deck talk voice that he first started with was going to be his voice. And I think at some point, it's interesting to say, so I share other anecdotes. When I was driving down the street and I heard a commercial, and it was a commercial for something where they were interviewing this very smart professor, and this very smart professor was using that deck talk voice for the voice that we've come to know as Stephen Hawking's voice. And I thought then how interesting that all of us, that we all obviously can recognize that as Stephen Hawking. Otherwise, they wouldn't have used it in that commercial. So there's so many nuances to when the voice becomes my voice, when the voice can be understood, which is what I talked about, and why people choose the voices that they do. My experience is that people choose a voice that can be best understood. So that was a long, rambling answer to you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you to all who attended this session. We'll go ahead and close this one out. If you would like to join us for the lightning talks that will be going on next, we'd love to have you as part of that. I think those will be in track 1 if I remember correctly. So feel free to jump in there and see some of the quick pieces and tidbits that people would like to share. Kathy, thanks so much for sharing your insight and your experience. We really appreciate that. And thank you to all who've attended. Don't forget to join us again tomorrow, starting at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for our keynote speech with Lauren Enders, and then we'll move into additional sessions throughout the day. Again, thanks everybody, and have a great evening.